Good afternoon. My name is Alena Allen, and I'm Deputy Director of the AALS. I'm excited to welcome you to How to Become a Law Professor, How to Become a Law Teacher webinar. I am joined today by 8 wonderful panelists, and today's webinar is really a testament to the work of Dean Sean Scott and Judy Arene, Executive Director of AALS. They came up with the Becoming a Law Teacher website, which if you have not had a chance to look at, I highly encourage you to do so. It is a wonderful source of information about how to become a law teacher, and it is way more comprehensive than we could ever be in 90 minutes. So this is a broad overview of and I encourage you to dig deeper. Professor. The second part is process, applying to become a law teacher. And the fourth part is Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. As the moderator, I will be moderating the session and I will be looking at your questions, but I will try to save most of the questions till the end. I will keep introductions very, very short to save time for questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first set of panelists. Our first panelist is Tiffany Atkins, Assistant Professor at Elon. Our second panelist is Zamir Ben-Dan, Assistant Professor at the University of Houston. And last but not least, Beth Zilberman, Assistant Professor. Question goes to you, Professor Ben-Dan. Just can you talk a little bit about your journey to becoming a law professor? When did you know you wanted to become a law professor, and sort of what did the journey look like for you?
Hi, everybody. So I guess I first became kind of interested because I don't think I really had a solid interest until when I decided to apply. I was kind of interested in being a law professor when I was actually in law school. And when I was in law school, I served as a mentor sorts to a lot of other students in terms of serving as a research assistant and a teaching assistant, more so a teaching assistant for a lot of students. And I found that I liked doing that. And so when I graduated law school, I had the intention of becoming a public defender, but I always thought that maybe somewhere along the line in my future that a law professorship would be part of that. So I worked as a public defender, and then I was pushed into writing a law review article by an intern of mine. And so I did that, and I actually enjoyed the process a lot. And so I started writing a lot on my own. And so I wrote a few law review articles before I got to the position that I'm in now. In 2019, I became an adjunct professor at Baruch College, which was one of my old schools. I'd got my bachelor's at Baruch College, and so I became an adjunct there. Then I started adjuncting at CUNY Law in 2020 during the pandemic. And then in 2021, I became the interim director of the lawyering program. And so pretty much I got my teaching experience through adjuncting, and then that directorship that I got through adjuncting at CUNY Law. I didn't do any fellowships or visiting assistant professorships, which was, I think, the route that people generally took, but I kind of was just ignorant of that and I didn't really know about it. So I adjuncted and I wrote on my own. And then when I got the directorship for CUNY, the interim directorship, that's when I made the decision that, all right, I think I'm going to do this full time. And so I applied, and here I am now at Temple.
Do you think that the adjunct position was helpful in preparing you?
I think it was, because it provided me teaching experience. And then me writing on my own provided me with the research experience. And then, of course, me writing while practicing, I think, helped out a lot, because it showed that I was, I guess, capable of producing scholarship, despite having, other obligations.
And how did the adjuncting position come about?
It's not what you know, it's who you know. So I knew somebody at Baruch College, and they were able to get me the adjunct position there. And then CUNY Law, the person who was the director of the program before I became the interim director, was not somebody that I knew, but they asked me for references, and I gave the references of professors that I had who were still there. So that's how that one came through.
Thank you. And Professor Ben-Dan referenced that being a visiting assistant professor is generally the route that people take on their journey to becoming a law teacher. Professor Michaels, you were a visiting associate professor at GW, and you were a federal court on the federal circuit, a federal clerk on the federal circuit. So can you talk a little bit about both of those experiences and how they helped you in your journey to becoming a law teacher?
Sure. So yeah, clerking at the federal circuit was something I did right out of law school, and it was definitely helpful as far as seeing a lot of interesting legal issues and sort of getting ideas for things to write about. And then I practiced for a few years after doing that, and I wrote, I was able to publish 2 articles while I was practicing, which was difficult, but basically having those articles as well as the federal circuit clerkship was able to help me get the VAP position at GW, the visiting assistant or associate professor there which is a 2-year position, which was very helpful to me because it gave me a lot more time to write and work on a couple sort of more substantial articles, one of which ended up being my job talk paper for going on the market. So, I think a 2-year VAP is helpful in that way, because you can spend sort of the first year writing, and then you can get ready to go on the market, get your references in order and everything, and go on the market. And so then I ended up getting the tenure track position at Houston from that. And then it's also, of course, helpful because it gives you some teaching experience that you can have and talk about before you go into an actual tenure track position.
So Professor Atkins, Professor Zilberman, Professor Michaels, you were all VAPs. And one issue for people is that they can have trouble coming up with an article idea. They don't know what to write about. And so VAPs can sometimes help you with the writing process. Can somebody speak to that, how their VAP may have helped them sort of get over that hurdle and get the first publication published?
I guess I can jump in here. One of the things I found most helpful about my VAP was I knew that I was visiting and I wasn't going to be offered sort of a permanent position there. And so I felt more free to get advice from people about where I was in the process. I wasn't worried about whether this person would judge the progress of my writing and whether they would hire me later. So I felt like I could be freer with the ideas I had. And then also while I was visiting, I got to see other scholars come in and present their work during faculty development, and it exposed me to how folks talk about their ideas, getting feedback on their ideas, which sort of helped me as I developed my own. So I felt like it was a safe space for me to get feedback and also to observe what others were writing about and how they articulated their ideas.
I can jump in as well. And I second everything that Professor Atkins just said. But in addition to, I think there's a lot of benefit to going to conferences and those types of things that you could do while I was in a fellowship, but a VAPR fellowship, and kind of getting exposure even more broadly to other scholars and kind of the community that you're entering into and how it all works. And echoing what Professor Atkins says, there's not really the stakes of like, oh, I'm going to lose my job if I talk to this person about this. So being able to kind of network in a way that's easier for us to do when we're kind of new to this world.
And so somebody mentioned, how do you get a VAP? So Professor Zilberman, your VAP was more clinically focused. How did that come about? How did you know about the VAP? I will say that the Becoming a Law Teacher website has a list of all reoccurring VAPs. And so you can there to find information about VAPs that occur every year. There are some schools that have non-reoccurring VAPs that you can just find randomly on their website. They might have a curricular need and post a temporary position. But Professor Zilberman, can you talk to us about sort of how you found your position?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a little bit of like I kind of tripped into my fellowship in a way. I was finishing an Equal Justice Works fellowship and just saw a posting for a fellowship and was kind of not thinking about academia at the time, but it was in the area that I wanted to practice, and it was clinical, and so it was kind of like you get to practice but also try teaching, and so I really liked that. But I'll say, listservs and like getting forwarded listservs. So if you speak your interest to a professor, we get a bunch of postings for fellowships and VAPs and all that. And so if you could connect to people in your world who are on these listservs that can then forward them, that has been very helpful as well. And then looking at various boards. So for clinical, for example, the Clinical Law Association has like a listing that they do, and word of mouth is kind of the other way that I see.
Thank you. Professor Atkins, how did you find your VAP?
Mine was also sort of accidental. I really consider myself an accidental law prof, and I'll talk about that later. So I was ending a fellowship. I had done a 2-year legal writing fellowship, and I was ending that fellowship and had connected with the dean at Wake Forest at a networking event. And she mentioned, we're looking for a visitor. Would you be interested in visiting? And I really had no context for what that meant. So it was sort of a 1-year come and visit. You'll teach these courses for us. And during that time, we'll offer you the opportunity to conference and to participate in our faculty development. And so during that time, I began researching and writing an article that I took as I went into interviews for the next year. So it really was a springboard, but how I came across it was really to what Professor Ben-Dan said earlier, was really who I knew and how she was able to connect me to this visitorship.
Thank you. So who you know, how do you develop those relationships with people who are sort of guiding your career path? Professor Zilberman, can you sort of talk about the role of mentoring in your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been incredibly fortunate to have really wonderful mentors kind of like from law school, even before law school on, who have helped me in this career and, reaching out to people that I interned with before law school at a legal organization. But I think, one of the things that I found most helpful is like asking folks who inspire you or who you think might do something that you want to do, if there's a way that you can help them and assist them in something. So for, in the beginning in my law school career, it was working with a professor who had a special interest project that she was doing. And I just thought she was really cool. And I was like, I want to do that. That sounds like fun. Can I help? And then that created, a relationship that then she was able to really help me when I started wanting to teach and developing what I wanted to do. And I think, really as much as, you're able to kind of find ways to just reach out to folks who seem to be doing things that you are interested in and just have a conversation with them, take them out to coffee, take them out to lunch, and kind of see if there's something that you could do. Once I got further in my career, it was, help offering to read articles for folks that they were writing or scholarship that they were writing, even though I'm like, I would say, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm happy to take a look. And it turned out that then when I provided helpful feedback, that they would then assist me in a similar way. And it, just kind of finding those avenues for communication and sharing of thoughts and ideas. And then those people get really invested in you, I think, and help to further you along. So I think, trying to find stuff that folks are doing that interests you and ask, how can I help? Or what can I do to be a part of that?
Thank you. There are affinity groups that provide mentorship for people who are interested in law teaching. Professor Atkins, can you talk about your experience with affinity groups and how they may have helped you in your journey to become a law teacher?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I really consider myself an accidental law prof. Law teaching was not something I considered for myself as a law student. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that in my classes, none of my professors looks like me. So it wasn't, the quote, you can't be what you don't see. I never saw a woman, I never had a class with a woman of color or a Black woman in class. So it never dawned on me that I could do this work. So it wasn't until many, many years later when I thought, okay, I was practicing and someone invited me to teach a class, and I thought, thought that this was a career that I could have. So for me, affinity group affiliation was very important because I didn't develop that network of mentors as a law student. And it wasn't until later that I was able to develop that mentorship. So if you don't develop the mentors, either because you're shy and you don't reach out to faculty, or because you're hesitant because you don't think it's something that you can do after law school, there certainly are groups that you can affiliate with. And what I would say is find a group that is either related to an identity or your interest. So for me, I found an affinity group that was based on my identity as a Black woman, and that is the Lutie Lytle Collective. So Lutie Lytle is the first Black woman law professor in the United States. And so there is a collective of Black women that meet to support each other in their scholarship, and then also support each other in breaking into the professorate, which is what I call it, sort of breaking in, depending on how you're doing that. And so within Lutie, I found mentors who read articles for me, articles that later became my job talk paper. As I navigated the market just this past year, they helped me crystallize what my research agenda was and my methodology, things that because I hadn't planned to become a law professor, they were foreign to me. I didn't know how to articulate what it was I wanted to write about. And so they helped me articulate those ideas and my methodology as a scholar. They helped me navigate job talks. You know, I would have never known how to handle the job talks and the offers when they came in, but for the women who have sort of come around me and supported me and mentored me in those ways. And so I think it's critical that if you're not if you don't have an existing group of mentors from law school, that you find groups like Lutie or groups that are for your identity or your interest, where they can come alongside and help you. So I expanded my network of mentors exponentially from Lutie, and think that I wouldn't have been successful on the market and writing generally if it wasn't for this group. So I highly recommend that you find those groups that can support you in entering the market.
Thank you, Professor Atkins. Lutie is specifically geared towards African-American women who are interested in law teaching, or law teachers, or becoming deans. But there are a host of other affinity groups. And again, if you go to the Becoming a Law Teacher website, there's a list and contact information for other affinity groups for those of you who want to get on listservs. There was a question about sort of salaries associated with visiting associate professorships in the chat, and whether or not it was difficult to live off of the salary of a visiting assistant professor. Any thoughts on that? Did you find the salary to be unfair? Was it difficult for you to meet your basic needs on the salary?
I mean, so my salary when I was a VAP was about 60K, I think, which was like a huge pay cut because I had just been in practice at a law firm. But I mean, I had saved some money when I was at the law firm, and so I was able to, I mean, it's, you know, you can live on that still, but that's what it was.
Thank you. For current law students, I'm sure they might be wondering what's the value of moot court and law review, and whether or not that has any impact on the teaching market. What are your thoughts on the role of being a member of the moot court board or being a member of the law review, and whether or not that's helpful and how it translates to becoming a law teacher?
I think that it can be helpful. I did not do law review. I'm a first-gen student. And so when law review came around and they thought, I'm thinking, I don't know what law review is. Why would I want to read articles? This makes no sense to me. I'm going to do moot court. So I think that there is currency. People certainly look to it. But I would say for law students, even if you didn't do law review, find ways to write. What law schools are interested in is your interest and your ability to produce scholarship. So write something, write an op-ed, write an article, write a note, try to get it published. If you're working in a firm, offer to write their firm newsletter. I think as long as you're writing something, it shows the ability to engage in scholarship. So even if you don't do those traditional things, I think if you can show writing and interest in scholarship, I think that that will also serve you on the market.
Yeah, I also was not on a journal. I did move court instead also, but I did publish a student note with a different journal at a different school while I was in law school, which I think is more helpful than just site checking other people's articles. So
Yeah, I'll concur with that. I wanted no parts of law review when I was a student. It's great, no disrespect, but yeah, I didn't do law review. I did moot court as well, but I would definitely harp on the importance of writing something. Part of, when I had the possible vision of going, me publishing law review articles was a big thing for me.
I'm the same. I just did not, I had no idea what law review was. So I was just like, oh, that sounds boring for me. But now I appreciate the value of it, obviously. But, at the time I was like, I want to go do work and pro bono work and whatever. But I will say, I think if I would have written something in law school, I would have felt a little bit more confident that first article, because I definitely felt like I was entering into uncharted territories. And had I had something kind of like under my belt, that probably would have given me a little bit more confidence first round. So I think I agree with everybody else. Like, if you can write something.
Professor Michaels, can you talk a little bit about what the publication process looked like for you as a law student? How did you find the journal to publish your note?
yeah, I mean, it's basically the same more or less as it is when you're a professor or, out of law school. I just submitted it on, I think, Scholastica to a bunch of different journals, and sort of to my surprise, I got some offers. Yeah, so I would encourage people to go ahead and submit if they're, I wasn't sure if anyone would want to publish it, but it turned out, there are a lot of specialty journals out there at a lot of different schools, and so if you write a good enough article, I think, there's a decent chance someone will want to publish it.
So the importance of writing hopefully has come through to any potential law professors. Anything else that you can think of that students should be doing while they're in law school that could be helpful if they want to become a law teacher ultimately?
I think working as a research assistant for a professor or two can definitely be helpful. I did that when I was in law school, and the professor I worked for was very helpful for me as like a reference, when I was going on the market and everything. And so, and even now when I'm going up for tenure, she's still one of my references. So it's definitely helpful to sort of, get some mentors who are professors, as well as just sort of to see some of, more what professors do as far as research.
I'd say this isn't for law school, but after law school, as many opportunities you have to like teach, even if it's just coming, I think Professor Atkins had mentioned, teaching a class for a professor or doing CLEs or those types of things, I think is really helpful. And so, entering into my fellowship, I was able to, like, on my application for the fellowship, say, I haven't taught, but I have done a bunch of CLEs. So that's something, right? And so any opportunity to kind of get yourself out there and doing public speaking and teaching and all that, I think might be helpful as well.
So when we think about becoming a law teacher, there are traditional doctrinal teachers who teach contracts, property, criminal law. And then there are clinical faculty who will run a clinic. And Professor Zilberman, you run a clinic. Can you sort of talk about how being a clinician is different than being a traditional doctrinal faculty member?
I could talk about it from the viewpoint of my institution, but every institution is a little bit different in how they deal with it. So I think the trend now is kind of leaning towards we're all kind of the same in some respects, in terms of, what our roles are in terms of faculty governance and that type of thing at my institution. At other schools, there are different tracks for doctrinal folks and clinical folks. I'll tell you, like, what the day-to-day looks like is I'm, supervising students, helping in their casework. They're working with real clients. And my seminar classes are usually more focused on lawyering skills versus kind of the substantive immigration law stuff. I will be teaching a doctrinal class in the future, though, or in the spring. And so, clinicians do sometimes do doctrinal and clinical work. And I think as the ABA is kind of moving towards more experiential stuff, there might be a little bit of a shift in terms of maybe a blurring of the lines between the two, but at some institutions there is kind of a clear divide, and others they're a little bit more similar.
Thank you. And in addition to clinical faculty, there are legal writing faculty. And Professor Atkins, can you talk a little bit about the legal writing faculty world?
Yeah, so when I began teaching as a legal writing instructor and professor. And so there we're focusing on the skills of writing, teaching students how to write objectively and then persuasively. And to what Professor Zilberman said, depending on the institution, there are different roles that legal writing faculty take. So here I teach legal writing, but I also teach doctrinal subjects like family law and race law. So my role is sort of hybrid. And in the role I'll take on currently, it's sort of moving more towards doctrinal, civil procedure, and race law, and some others. So when you're sort of thinking about teaching, legal writing as a discipline is certainly an option. You may be in an institution where your legal writing crosses over with doctrinal, and you're able to do both. My current role as a legal writing professor still requires writing. It still requires me to write. So even as you're teaching these, you're not sort of, in some institutions, you're still required to write. So it could be a legal writing with no writing requirement for the professor, or legal writing with a writing requirement, and also other courses. So when you're thinking about it, often this is a way that you can begin teaching and learn the skill of the art of teaching while also doing some writing. So it's another option if you're thinking about breaking into the academy. That's another option as well.
Thank you. There was a question about the importance of grades. How important do you think law school grades are in getting hired on the law teaching market?
What's interesting is I will say that this recent hiring cycle, I think out of all the places that I interviewed with, all the places that I applied, only 2 schools asked for my transcript. And so I had, sort of lots of job talk, lots of callbacks, and only 2 of those schools even asked for transcripts. So I think it really does depend on the school. Maybe as higher up you go in the rankings, maybe they care a little bit more, but out of the many schools I applied to, only 2 really even asked about my transcript. So I think it just, traditional law school answer, I think it depends on the school and the type of position maybe you're seeking.
Thank you.
I'll second. That was the same experience for me as well too.
So,
Can I just add something on? Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think what the schools really care about is, can you publish, and can you publish in good journals? So I think grades are sort of a proxy for that. But if you didn't have great grades, but you have 3 publications in Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, and Yale Law Review, I mean, I think they don't care what your grades are, so I think that's what they care about more so than your grades.
So as we think about minimal qualifications, sometimes you will hear that a PhD is necessary for law teaching now, that sort of the needle has moved. I don't think anybody has a PhD on the panel, am I right? So at least for these 4, the needle has not moved. And so what are your thoughts about whether or not a PhD, LLM, VAP is necessary? Obviously, nobody has a PhD on the panel, so PhD, I'm sure the panel would say, is not necessary. But in terms of minimal qualifications, how would you define it?
I'd say it kind of goes back to what Professor Atkins had been saying about kind of it depends on the institution, right? So I know like in this round of hiring that we did this year, there might have been somebody who had a PhD, but I don't remember. It was not talked about in our decision making, right? So it's not like a deal breaker, but I think as you go up in the rankings, it probably becomes more important, would be my guess.
I agree. I think, again, it depends. I was on last year I was on our recruitment committee, and I think that it wasn't something that was sort of on our rubric of things that we must have. It's nice to have if you have it, not necessarily required. I think to Professor Michaels's point, what we were really looking for is, can the person teach? Our law school is really a highly experiential program. So can the person teach and can they publish? And we did have professors here who had a PhD, but the questions were still the same. Can they teach and can they publish? And I think if you can satisfy those, you'll likely have success, but that again depends on your institution and the kind of, if you're doing like interdisciplinary work, maybe it's more valuable there, but I think it just depends.
Thank you. This is sort of the end of section 1, which was talking about the journey to become a law teacher. So I want to thank Professor Atkins, Professor Michaels, Professor Ben-Dan, and Professor Zilberman for joining us. If they can, they'll stick around towards the end for more chat. Some of them might have time commitments and might not be able to stick around, but thank you so much. Now I want to talk a little bit about nuts and bolts. And so AALS has the faculty appointments register, and that opens in June and runs from June through September. And that's basically a form that people fill out if they want to become a law professor. And so this form is then distributed to all member law schools and all fee-paid law schools. And so the fee associated with filling out the FOR form is $290. But AALS has fee waivers for people who might have financial hardships. And so you will hear a lot about the FOR form. And I thought it would be good for you to see what a FOR form looks like and to understand what people are talking about with the FOR. And so again, the process is you fill out this form, which talks about your background, your teaching preferences, and then it's distributed to law schools. And then law schools go through FOR forms, and we'll talk about what that looks like with panel 3, and then we'll invite you to interview with them. Now, first round interviews are typically on Zoom, but the FOR process makes it a lot easier for candidates because you don't have to apply individually to 150 law schools. Your application materials get electronically transmitted, and it's a lot easier for you. The other important thing that comes with the faculty appointments register is that you get access to a placement bulletin, which is published 4 times a year, that law schools submit ads about the jobs that they have available, and then you will know specifically what law schools are looking for. And so sort of with that background, I will pass things along to our extraordinary program manager, Alexa, to walk you through the FOR form.
Thanks, Alena. So we're going to start out on far.als.org. And so you see it here. Just to speed things along, I've already created an account, but when you're new to the FAR, you'll go down here and create an account, put your login or your email, and you'll get a confirmation email. And then you can set up your account. So like I said, I've already created my account. So we go here to continue your FAR application. The first thing you're going to have to fill out is contact information. You won't be able to move on to the other pages until you fill out this, just email, phone number, things like that. Every page will have a button on the bottom saying save and continue. If you don't click that, your information will not be saved. So please be sure as you're working on this to save as you move along. So the second page is the type of position you are seeking. So you have to select at least one, but you can select all or whichever ones you are interested in applying for. Then we have demographic information. So we have drop-down menu for gender, and you select which applies. We ask for veteran status, race and ethnicity. If you do select other for anything, a text box will appear and you can fill out the relevant information. And you are able to put multiple things in this box. Then we have education. So you're able to put up to 4 degrees. The first one usually is your first law degree. So that's typically a JD, and it'll ask you for some basic information about what law school you attended, graduation date, things like that. There is a checkbox here that if you were a member of a law review, you can select that and put in your law review name and the position that you had at the law review. If you look here, so here are the other categories for degrees. So we have advanced law degrees, such as an LLM or SJD, advanced degree, or an undergraduate degree. So like I said, up to 4 degrees you can put in here. And again, save and continue. This is our teaching preferences and publications page. So you can put up to 5 teaching preferences. So it's a drop-down menu. We have many options of different law school subjects, and you can put up to 5. If something that you are interested in is not included in the drop-down, there is a text box which you can include another a subject area or explain anything that you would like. Then we have our major published writings. So you indicate how many publications you have put out. In terms of putting details for those, you are only allowed to put 5, and only one of those can be unpublished, such as a job talk paper. So if it was published, be sure to click this checkbox that it had been accepted for publication. And you put the name of your publication, your citation, and your web address. And then, yeah, so like I said, you can put up to 5. The last thing on this page is our geographic restriction. So if you will only select a position in a certain state, you would put it here. And again, there's a drop-down menu to select from. Or if there's a state or a location that you would not accept a position in, you can indicate that in this line. The next page is employment experience. So you're able to put up to 7 past positions. Here's the drop-down menu. So law school teaching asks a couple more questions, and I did an example one here for you put your law school, the type of position you have, and the law subjects that you taught. And again, drop-down menu, many options. And there is an option if a subject that you taught is not included in the drop-down, you can put it here. The other categories for employment type, we have government, judicial clerkships, nonprofit, public interest, private industry, private practice, or something's not included. Again, there is another option. And then there is a text box if you feel anything needs explanation. This page is for if you were admitted to the bar and then your references. So if you have been admitted to the bar, you would check this box, a drop-down menu of the various states. You would indicate which states you were admitted in. And then if there's another location that was not included, you can include it here. For references, you're able to put up to 3 references, and it just asks for basic contact information for them. And then again, another text box, if there's anything about your application in general that you feel needs further explanation, you can always put it here. The last page that you have of inputting information is your document uploads. So none of these are required, but the options are you can upload a CV, a research agenda, job talk paper, or diversity statement. And you can upload PDF, documents, anything here that is relevant. And then the last page that you'll see is your review your FAR application, and then you can click this button, preview your FAR application. And this is what it'll look like to law schools. I did not fill out in great detail, so mine looks a little short, but the top part is your contact information and demographic information. And then the bottom part is everything else that we discussed. Because the FAR is currently closed, it does not have a submit button. So when we open in the summer and you're ready to submit, there will be a button for you to submit and enter payment information. And then that is the FAR. Back to you, Alena. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for that demonstration of the FAR form. So now we will shift to our third part, which is applying to become a law professor. And I will quickly introduce our panelists. Professor Adam Feibleman, Professor of Law at Tulane, Professor Steve Clowney at University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, Dean Cassandra Hill, Dean of Northern Illinois, and Dean Tamara Lawson, Dean of Washington University in Seattle. Thank you so much for joining us. So my first question goes to the hiring chairs, Professor Clowney and Professor Feibleman. Alexa just did a great job of showing us what the FAR form looks like in all of the fields. Can you sort of walk us through how Tulane and Arkansas uses the form to pull down the candidates? And I will pick on Professor Clowney first, alphabetical order. So Professor Clowney.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. I would say the FAR is by far the most important document in the entire process. It's what we use to take the huge sort of massive applicants. You know, we get a few hundred in any given year. So we take those 300 or 400 and we bring that down here to about 10 or 12 folks that we're going to do a screening interview with. And that's done almost completely with the FAR. I think the other thing that I want to sort of stress just off the top is a lot of times we talk about the hiring market like it's one market. I want to say that I don't think that's true. I think that what is happening at like the top 15 or 20 schools is pretty different from what's happening at a school like Arkansas or Kentucky, which are the places that I've taught. I mean, Harvard is coming in and asking, is there anyone in this stack of applicants who's the best in the world at what they do, right? That's not what we're doing at the University of Arkansas, right? Like what we're trying to do is we're trying to find people who are going to contribute in a scholarly way, who are going to be sort of good teachers, and who are going to sort of serve the law school. So I just want to highlight that I think a lot of these questions are difficult to answer because the truth is it's going to be different for a top 20 school versus schools that are a little bit farther down the chain, like the University of Arkansas. So what I do when I get that FAR form is the first thing that I do is I am going to sort those FAR forms by what you have expressed an interest in teaching, right? So this is going to be one of the big differences between the top schools and maybe the bulk of schools in the middle. At a Harvard, they are just looking to hire great scholars. We, almost every time that we are hiring someone, are replacing someone that has retired or gone to another school. So we had a criminal law professor that left. We need someone to teach criminal law in the fall. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm sorting those FAR forms by our teaching needs. So I think that what that means is if you get a call saying that one of these schools wants you to interview, the first question that you need to ask is what areas are you hiring in, right? Why did you, what was it about my FAR form that why did you pull that one out of the stack? And in particular, what is the topic that you want me to teach? And then you want to show some excitement for that topic. So after that, after we sort the FAR forms based on a topic, I look at things like demographic information. I glance at what school you went to. I look at your work experience. And then the big thing I do is I look at the publications. You know, have you written anything about the topic that we're looking to hire in? So based on a combination of those sort of 4 or 5 things, we're going to sort you into no, you don't fit for us this year, or yes, we'd like to talk to you sort of more in a screening interview. And it really is pretty quick. I mean, they give us 400 or 500 of those FAR forms, and I'll take a look at that FAR form in, I don't know, 30 seconds, a minute, and make an initial decision. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Clowney. Professor Feibleman.
Hi. So I agree with much of that. You know, I don't know how many of you all were looking at the kind of final FAR form for the first time, but I recall just being a bit shocked at how, you know, the accomplishments of so many amazing people get reduced to 1 page and a few entries. So people have gotten, I think as Professor Clowney was suggesting, people who've done this a while have developed, I think, an ability to kind of use these to kind of gain some meaning, you know, real meaningful information. It's kind of its own art form of reading the FAR form. But I think that in my experience, people approach this somewhat differently, even within any committee. And so I don't know what others' experiences are, but most of the experiences that I've had at different schools, the committee members will be given the forms and will be generally asked to kind of come back with a list of people they're interested in interviewing, often kind of a ranking of either half the book or all the book, and a good deal of flexibility, in my experience, on the committee for bringing forward or ranking people that they are interested in interviewing. So I agree that most searches tend to be at least somewhat curricular driven. I guess one difference that I had, and with Professor Clowney's comments, and maybe this is just my own experience, is that even in searches where there's a kind of a curricular focus, there is often, I've found, leeway to kind of find people in the book who stand out for a variety of reasons, who may not be precisely within the curricular fit, or just excellent, and for all sorts of reasons. And generally, I've felt that I've had the latitude to at least kind of make a case for, considering them or discussing them within the committee, even if they may not be perfect curricular fits. And sometimes that's a fruitful conversation, and sometimes it's not. But the one just quick thing I would say about going back to the FAR form is, given how quickly many of the reviewers are going to be looking at your form, I think it's really important to get feedback on how you fill it out, because when someone's spending 30 seconds or a minute looking at your form, things that are idiosyncratic are going to stand out, and part of the initial part of the process is kind of figuring out what the conventions of the process are, and if someone's form suggests that they haven't done that, then that's not determinative in any way, but it's not the kind of review you're going to want of your form at that stage. So I encourage everyone to get as much feedback from mentors and people who've gone through the process recently in filling out the form.
That's a great point. And I think just one example would be like, what is the package of courses that you've listed that you're interested in, right? You want them to make some kind of sense, right? So I know property goes pretty well with things like land use and real estate transactions, maybe trust and estates. But if you're sort of scattered, if you're like legal writing and crim law and torts, that maybe looks like a person who hasn't thought about the process and what they really want to do and who they are as a scholar quite as much. I think that's a really good point.
Thank you. To your point, Professor Feibleman, there are some quick FAR hacks, sort of what you do and what you don't do, that I think all of us sort of know about. Would anybody like to comment about sort of general advice about filling out the FAR and something that a candidate should not do when they're filling out the FAR?
Well, I'll volunteer one that's low-hanging fruit, which is be as sparing as possible, and if at all, if you can, avoid any geographic restrictions. I mean, if you really, really know that you have constraints and it would be, not really not candid to reveal those at the front end, then I think that's a restriction you might note. I would definitely talk to other people before you list it. And this is not just a hack. I mean, I've definitely had the experience with people who really felt like they didn't want to be in a particular place or region and thought that it was a restriction, and it really hasn't been. It's been a strong preference, but not a restriction. And then things played out. I know of a couple of instances where people ended up in places that I think they would have said they would not go geographically. So that's one. I think as sparing as possible and within the limits of candor on geographic restrictions.
Thank you. To the lovely deans. So I think there are a lot of questions about readiness and how many publications do you need, and does it matter if you have a secondary from a law school? Does it need to be a primary? Sort of what advice can you provide for a candidate who is looking at their CV and thinking, am I ready to become a law teacher? Will I get serious consideration from law schools?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. I want to just kind of echo what was already said about there's not just a single market. I think Professor Clowney was mentioning that, right? It really depends on the schools. So for me, like one's readiness for the teaching market, as well as the schools, hiring decisions depends on the nature and educational mission of that particular law school to which you're applying. It depends on whether a candidate is applying for an academic or a clinical teaching position, and even on the subject matter expertise, such as legal writing or contracts. Your earlier panels talked about how you get ready for those things, like, you know, a VAP, a fellowship. Working with your feedback from mentors can help you know if you're ready. And even when I kind of reflected on the discussion that happened earlier, I was like, wow, there's application ready, then there's mentally prepared, you know, for what you're about to do. Are you ready to make the transition from practice to academia? Because I've seen people struggle with that transition when they thought they were really ready to be law professors. So the questions you want to ask yourself: do I have publications? Some people, I honestly think you need to have 3 publications already under your belt before you go on the market. For my school, I wouldn't necessarily say you have to have 3. There are plenty of schools out there that you could have a work in progress ready, something ready for your job talk could mean that you're ready. Are you ready for teaching at a law school? Have you taught before? 2 thoughts here. Some say being an adjunct is quite helpful for you on the market. There are some higher ranked schools that would say, we don't want you to have been an adjunct before. We're more concerned about how many articles you have. Another thing to think about when you're asking yourself these questions and whether you're ready is, do you have recommendations lined up? Do you have a faculty member, one of your faculty members who are willing to write a strong letter for you or to speak on your behalf? So just summing it up, thinking about publications, works in progress. Are you ready for your job talk? Have you mooted your job talk? References and teaching experience if you're just talking about the application.
And I would echo what Dean Hill has added, and I would divide it in 2 categories, 2 broad categories. One, is your scholarly promise obvious? And there's lots of ways to make it obvious to those that will be reading it or those that will be evaluating you. And if you're not looking at a teacher scholar position, meaning a tenure track position, I would just modify that. Is your promise as a teacher and a member of the academic community obvious? Are you able to illuminate that your expertise is obvious, right? And your willingness to help students is obvious. And your commitment to the student experience, including outcomes and assessments. That's a part where it's really, I think, sometimes challenging for a new colleague to even wrap their head around assessments. So be ready for that in the interview process. And the second category is support of your candidacy. Has that been established? Do you have folks, whether they're folks like us that are already in the academy or folks in the legal profession or other relevant professions, because interdisciplinarity is very important right now. A lot of schools are looking for that also in a candidate's repertoire. Is that support established? Are there various individuals that are willing to speak on your behalf? Have they followed your career? Do they even know you're applying? That's a mistake sometimes candidates make. Keeping their cheerleaders, right, ready to cheer, keeping them informed, and also seeking their advice as to knowing, as Dean Hill and others have pointed out, which applications maybe they would be better to support, and maybe other applications you need to have a different group of cheerleaders to support, and maybe being agile enough as an applicant to know the difference and to pursue various tiers of your approach to this transition in your legal profession. There is a commitment that you will be making, or a trade-off, or however you want to look at it, between the identities of various schools. I mean, I think we are pre-programmed to look at schools around ranking numbers, and I'm pushing back on that idea. And I would look at looking at schools around their missions. And different schools have different, missions. Some are practice-ready missions. Some want you to impact the literature and impact the profession in a certain way. Some have a global or international mission focus. Because the reason I push back on the ranking, viewpoint is that I think we all are seeking to build leaders in our profession, leaders in law, leaders in the world. And that's what law schools do at all levels, at every level, at every ABA accredited law school. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here. And I see it as a larger community. And as a candidate, I think you should think of it that way. What part of the community do you want to launch yourself in? Where do you want to start? And your career is broad. Maybe you want to start at a certain type of school and move to a different type of school later, etc. So think about the type of students you want to be working with and what is going to be important to those students. Also, do you want to be in a regional school? Do you want to be in a national school? Is there a certain legal community you want to be in conversation with? These are things that should help you decide how your priority list should be organized.
Thank you, Dean Lawson. There's sort of been a theme about making sure that you've packaged yourself to the best of your ability. And part of that is course selection. And so as Professor Feibleman and Professor Clowney said, people tend to flip through 4 forms very, very quickly. And so deciding what courses to list can sometimes make or break you, specifically at regional law schools that might be looking for very specific subjects. Any sort of general advice in delineating your course package on the 4 form?
Well, I'll jump in on this because I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday about this. And I think, and this is building on what Professor Clowney was saying, but I think there are 2 main things that I encourage people to bear in mind. One is to think strategically about what kinds of positions schools are likely to fill, and every school has there are certain core topics that every school needs to fill, and so expressing an interest in those areas is going to, I think, enhance your likelihood to kind of fall within schools' radars, and expressing an interest in teaching, especially first-year courses is appealing to candidates. But it's also, I think, really important that you're, and this is what I think Professor Clowney was saying, that your teaching interests really reflect your experience and seem plausible given your experience and your research interests, and not there may be things that exceptions to this that you can explain in other parts of your application, but in general, I think when things don't match the experience, it seems curious to people, and if there are things that one would expect, like if someone's been a litigator for a long time and doesn't list Civ Pro, for example, maybe this is a bad example, but then that might also raise a question where someone has a real core competency and that's not listed on their teaching experiences. That would also at least be curious to people. And again, these are things that you can explain if you want or need to, but you should know that they may jump out in ways that you don't necessarily want when people are flipping through the FAR form.
I think that's great advice. I'll just tell you about what I did. I'm really passionate about land use. That's the thing I like to write about. That was what I knew I wanted to teach. So when I was putting that list of courses together, right, property obviously goes with land use, and every school in the country teaches property in the 1L year, so property number one, land use number two. Then I thought about, okay, what are some other things that I'm interested and that schools might need? I also put trust in estates. I had never written a will when I put trust in estates on my sort of form, but I knew that was another thing that everybody teaches, and that nobody does that, right? No, there are very few people who are super passionate about that. So schools are always looking for folks who can fill in there. So those are my top three classes. I also put real estate transactions and environmental law. I thought that sort of made sense. It listed the things that I was actually really fired up about, but I also had enough courses on there that schools need that it helped me get some interviews that I don't think I otherwise would have gotten.
Thank you, Professor Clowney. So, Dean Lawson, you mentioned references and having your cheerleaders and maybe having a different bunch of cheerleaders for different tiers of schools. Can you talk to us about how you go about approaching somebody to be a reference and what that will look like? I was just listed as a reference and the person didn't ask me. So that's a sort of no-no. So do you have any advice about that?
It doesn't sound like you're, as a recommender, you're happy about that. So everyone on the call, please don't do that to your recommenders. I think the first place to look for good recommenders or reference list are people that you've worked with that know you personally or know your work. That's what the schools want to hear. Not that you were a good neighbor or you knew so-and-so in law school so much as that you've worked with them and you're confident around their work ethic, their collegiality, and their promise, because a lot of the schools are taking a risk on the candidate based on factors that they can verify, and then the other ones they're not going to know until you're on their campus. So they want to feel very comfortable with individuals that know you and are confident in how you will perform, that can say for 100% certainty that you will be their best choice. So people that were your professors in law school, that's a great place to start. I know that not everyone has kept in good contact with their law school professors. So also people that have worked with you and can speak strongly about your level of expertise, your attention to detail, your collegiality and working with others. Every school wants good colleagues. Some might even refer to this kind of hiring as it's a marriage almost, but particularly tenured faculty positions. So they're looking for a lifelong good colleague in some cases. So think about marketing yourself in those ways. And yeah, each reference is going to be asked, how do they know you? And why do they know you? So think about what that answer is going to sound like to the recipient. And I would craft my list based on that.
Thank you. Dean Hill, can you walk us through what the process looks like? You fill out your form and faculty evaluate your form and they decide, we're interested in this candidate. We want to extend an interview to this candidate. What does the initial interview look like? And then if they progress past the initial interview, sort of what comes next?
Okay, so what Director Allen is referring to is like, your screening interview versus your on-campus interview. And we know that the screening interviews are usually done either at the faculty recruitment conference, or nowadays, many schools are doing those via Zoom or online with the faculty appointments committee. So that's really the thing to remember. These screening interviews will be about 30 minutes, maybe 45, but typically 30. They're with the faculty appointments committee. You can't do a deep dive in 30 minutes. So they're looking for certain information to see if they want to commit to exploring your candidacy more. So some questions, I'm just like reflecting on questions that we've used at the various law schools that I've been at for screening. There's going to be a question about what you're most excited about in terms of teaching. What's your subject matter expertise? What are you open to teaching? Again, keep in mind all of the other advice you received here on the panel today about how you craft that package to be very attractive. You'll get a question likely about your teaching philosophy, right? Have you taught before? What's your teaching style? How do you engage students? What do you know about assessment? So something related to teaching. Then you'll likely get a question, and this is again on the screening interview, about your research agenda, your scholarly interests, your area subject matter expertise. You may get a follow-up question about a committee member, especially if you have an article already written, a specific question about your article to engage you in your scholarship. So be ready to talk about your research agenda, be ready to talk about any articles that you have already published. Then I'm usually the one on our faculty appointments committee who asks this question: why our school in particular? So maybe you have a regional, a geographic connection to the school. Maybe the mission, vision, and values of the school are directly aligned with what you're interested in, what you're passionate about. So have a really good question for this, because I have seen times where a candidate will just move on to the next candidate because we don't feel like there'll really be that tie to our school in particular. And of course, they'll leave open time for questions from the candidates. So that's screening, quickly, 30 minutes. When you come back, and hopefully you'll be lucky enough to come back for an on-campus interview, the on-campus interviews are, of course, a deeper dive. You have dinner with a group of faculty, several faculty members. You have a series of interviews, usually small group interviews with faculty members. There'll be a time for you to do a job talk if this is a job for a tenure track or tenured position. And that's where you will actually speak about your research or your work in progress. You may even have a meeting with students. You know, every interaction with a member of the law school community is an interview. That includes the time that you'll have with your students. If this is a position for legal writing or clinical, you may be asked to give a teaching talk, right? They'll give you a topic and you may have a few students there and you'll actually show them how you will be a teacher in the classroom. Everything usually ends with a meeting with the dean, where you can have, you know, another chance to say it all over again, if you like, or to have your really high-level questions answered with the dean. So 2 different interviews.
Can I jump in on that, Alena?
Okay.
I'm going to follow up because I realized I didn't answer fully the question about the 2 different types of schools, and I will fill it in on top of Dean Hill's answer, which I concur with her answer. But I would just add that candidates need to be agile in this process and able to pivot, because you might have a short, the first interview, initial interview, where they only talk to you about teaching and they talk to you about scholarship in passing, or the reverse. They only talk to you about your scholarship and 3 people have read it and they're asking you about a footnote, etc. And they talk to you about teaching in passing. And so be prepared to know which schools are which schools are looking for scholars first, teachers second, which schools are looking for teachers first, scholars second, and which schools are looking for really an equal blend of both. And your references, going back to the other question, should be tailored around that for that school as well. So if you're talking to a school that is really looking for a national impact, and maybe they're that scholar first, teacher second type of school, make sure you have some people on your reference list that can talk to your national engagement, your participation in the field at a high level, and the impact that you're going to make. That's what schools are looking for. And the reverse too. Someone who could talk about your compassion for students, and that you are the type of professor that is going to make the student experience, you know, the best in the country. And that is someone who knows you well in those circles. And that's what schools want to know.
Thank you. Professor Clowney, Professor Feibleman, any advice about preparing for a job talk? I know when I was a newbie on the teaching market, the job talk is what made me the most afraid and what kept me up at night. So any sort of advice about how to approach a job talk? And Dean Hill mentioned perhaps having somebody moot them. I don't think I knew what mooting a job talk meant as an entry-level candidate.
Well, hopefully everyone on this call now will find someone to, and ideally more than someone to help them, because I agree, that is the most critical way to prepare. And so, and hopefully, when your people who are mentoring you along the way and your references will help you kind of assemble a team to moot. But definitely express interest in that. The other thing that I think is really tricky for candidates, especially candidates who are not in a fellowship or VAP, is it's actually really hard to see examples of job talks before you do it. And I believe it maybe the ALS resources has an example. I've referred people to that. And sometimes people or schools have recorded job talks, and it may be possible, if you know someone who's been on the market, to get authorization to see a recording of a job talk. I don't know that anyone's done that, but I thought to suggest that to someone recently. And if you have the opportunity to attend kind of faculty workshops or seminars, those are often very similar to a job talk and can be a way to get a sense of how they go. But I think it's really important, if at all possible, to see a few examples and definitely get mooted for yours.
Thank you, Professor Clowney. And then Dean Lawson. Professor Clowney, I can't hear you. So I'm going to move on to Dean Lawson and then come back.
Okay, I think the professor's frozen maybe, or something's going on, but I would just add, if you can find out from the chair of your hiring committee that some of the nuances around the job talk at that campus, that would be good to know, because some schools will have what they call a hot bench, where you have to be prepared for questions from the first minute you're speaking, and others are more formalized in a way. I was going to say more civilized, but more formalized, and they allow you to present for a certain number of minutes, and there's maybe the chair or some other senior faculty member is managing the queue, and you answer in that way. And the reason I think it's important for a candidate to know that in advance, they are also informed of what you're being judged on in that job talk. Some schools will be only judging you on the content and substance of your scholarly ideas, but other schools will be judging you on your ability to control a room. They'll be imagining this as if it were a classroom. They'll be imagining maybe the overeager participants as a student who is trying to interrupt you, and they'll be judging you on that. So you should be fully aware of what you're being judged on in the job talk session. So that's just an add-on to the professor's very important outline of the job talk.
Thank you. I'm going to try to work my way through some of the questions that have come in on the chat now. And so for foreign trained attorneys who are currently doing LLM in US universities, what is the value of doing an SJD for the purposes of teaching in US universities? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a stab. I mean, I think it can be quite useful, and that's definitely a pathway that some candidates have taken. But my sense, and my strong view actually, is that there's a wide variety of these programs, and the most important way in which they vary is how much actual engagement and support and mentorship you'll get from faculty there. And so I think the value is really a function of whether you have a champion who's really supporting your work and interested in going to bat for you on the academic market, and you know, if you have that kind of relationship, then I think it can be of a pathway. But it's you know, it's not the most common pathway. I think it's important to know that that it's not, again, the most common.
Thank you. Any recommendations for international students who English is not their first language? Many struggle with networking. When employers often don't even reply to applications. So any advice for international students?
Well, I think it's true for all applicants that not every school is going to respond to you. So I just want to throw that out there. It's not unique to international applicants per se. But I guess the question is trying to ask, how do you get noticed? How do you make yourself noticeable? And I think it's some of the same things that we've been highlighting, showing your readiness and actual support for your candidacy, both in your publications. And maybe in this particular case, your work around American law in particular, or any sponsor or reference in American law schools, if the question is targeted at foreign lawyers and foreign students. You're muted.
Thank you. Do hiring committees value judicial citations of candidates' articles?
It's definitely a plus, but my sense is that it may not be something that they'll know about. You know, that's something that I think would need to be brought to their attention, and may not be. You know, it's not clear that it's the most salient thing that you want to be advancing to the committee. It certainly depends, I think, on the nature of the citation. You know, if you've been cited by the Supreme Court in an important decision, then that's something you want them to know. You know, I've been cited in unpublished opinions by trial courts, and that's not necessarily something that I would want to kind of advance before other information about myself to a hiring committee.
Professor Clowney mentioned trust and estates as a high need course. Can you talk more about what courses tend to be higher need or more crowded? Is it correct to assume that all 1L courses are high need? Are there other upper level doctrinals that tend to be high need as well?
I think first year courses generally are something where a school or several schools will be looking for a candidate. So you always want to make sure you've put down first year subjects on your FAR form. I completely agree with Professor Clowney about wills and estates. That's my area. So it typically is something that a lot of schools are looking for. Things that may not necessarily be in demand. I hear from candidates that and other deans that they have common law is taken care of. Like everybody is usually looking for a common law position, but those are very coveted, sought after positions, maybe not a lot of need there. I definitely like to hear from my colleagues in this respect, because it differs. It just really depends on the school.
I think you should look at your selection as, am I a team player? Look at the school's required courses. Those are going to be the ones they have to fill. And anyone who's not taking at least what is thought of in the hallways as their fair share of that group, you know, is not going to be as valuable, I think. And then after you've taken a fair share of the required curriculum, then I think on top of that, what would you be adding to the electives, and how unique is your specialty, and how, you know, much does it cross over?
Thank you, Dean Hill and Dean Lawson. For references, how much importance do school place on who the reference is or the institution where they teach?
So I would say that it does matter to some extent, but I think the most valuable references on, at least on the kind of, to the extent that schools are interested in kind of scholarly promise, are people in the field, the relevant field, who can say this is a person who is has promise of advancing the literature, having an impact on the literature. That kind of reference may if there's someone who has credibility in the field, it matters really much less where they are. In my view, I think that's really valuable information to know. So I think familiarity with the work and the ability to kind of say, speak to kind of colleagues at other schools and say this person has genuine promise as a scholar in their field and is going to have an impact is I think the most important thing that at least my colleagues have looked at over the years.
Thank you, Professor Feibleman. Do you think that there is a bias against candidates who are older or who have significant practice experience in the law teaching market?
Do you want me to take a stab at that? Can you hear me now? Great. No, I don't think there is. I think there is a respect for sort of practice experience amongst most schools. I will say the one thing that you need to be careful of is if you have been practicing for a while, I think you do want to show that you understand that this job is a scholarly job, that it's not just about sort of coming back and telling war stories to the students, right? So you need to show that you have a scholarly agenda, right? And that really helps if you have sort of published sort of a paper or have sort of a paper or sort of two lined up. I think that's the one thing that I've seen sink candidates that have really great experience and could contribute a lot, but there's a worry that they are sort of retiring into teaching and don't understand that the job is teaching, scholarship, and service. Thanks.
I agree with that, and I would add, even if it's not a tenure track, a scholar teacher role, to emphasize for the candidate to emphasize that they understand that a lot goes into preparation for these classes in a way that students will be assessed, and they're committed to the assessment metrics, and they understand formative and summative assessment, which all of these terms are insider baseball. And if the candidate who's been in practice a long time can master a few insider baseball terms like that and be committed that they are actually transitioning their career into the academy as opposed to a lawyer that's showing up at a podium in front of a class, will, I think, launch them into the hearts of really the faculty, because that's what faculty are looking for, people like them. Even though we're all lawyers, we're in a different part of the legal profession, and they're looking for someone committed to the students and not only the profession itself.
Thank you, Dean Lawson.
Can I just add one?
Of course.
Yeah, because I think that Dean Lawson's touched on something that we haven't really talked about that I think is a really important part of the dynamic, which is that faculties are also thinking about hiring their colleagues who are going to participate in governance and guiding, policy, internal policy. And so this isn't necessarily at all, kind of exclusive to whether someone's been in practice for a long time, but it can be the kind of concern that would arise in that context. But faculties want to, have confidence that they're hiring people who, understand what it means to be part of an academic institution and how those are governed by faculty and in a collaborative collegial way, and that people, especially if they're in tenure track or long-term positions, are interested in being part of that environment and have the capacity to do so in a productive, collegial way.
Thank you, Professor Feibleman. What sort of communications occur outside of the FAR process? For instance, in some academic areas, it's common for a PhD advisor to reach out to colleagues at institutions that are hiring to say, hey, my student is really good, consider her. Does something similar happen in legal academia? Relatedly, I know that in the econ field, schools are moving earlier and earlier to grab candidates, moving outside of the typical meat market of the past. Is that happening in legal academia too?
Yes, some schools, depending on where you are more aggressive than others. Some have a whole booklet for their graduates that are sent around. I think the more effective method is someone who knows you well and is calling targeted schools around your candidacy. But yes, this does happen.
Thank you. How does the current economic climate, budget tightening, affect the law school teaching hiring market? And whether new dynamics are at play, example, law professors are responsible for more diverse course loads, more summer teaching loads, etc.
I think in a world of reduced budgets, it means sometimes there's less hiring, and that means that schools have to be really careful with the hiring that they do, right? So that means for people who are applying, what you're trying to do is sort of show your future colleagues that you are no risk, right? That you are going to, they need every hire to be a good hire. So you're going to show up, you're going to be enthusiastic about your teaching, that you have a scholarly agenda that you're looking forward to carrying out, and that you are going to be a dutiful and willing sort of committee servant. I think for us, that's the biggest thing that I've seen. There is a worry that, you know, maybe sometime in the future, the school cuts back on hiring. So we just need to make sure that everyone that we hire is a good egg, right? I mean, on our hiring committee, we have a real no jerks hiring sort of protocol. And I think that is more true now than it has been in the past.
Thank you. If you are selecting between a few different potential references, if the choice is not immediately clear, do you have any advice for how to have a semi-candid conversation with a mentor about the strength of their recommendation?
I'll go. Yeah, I think I think when you ask for a reference, it is completely fair to say something like, can you give me a strong reference? Right? Like if you say sort of like strong, enthusiastic, and if they hesitate at all, find somebody else. I think that is completely fair. And also if they say yes, then they have agreed to give you a stronger, enthusiastic reference. I would also just say that I don't think that the references are something to stress out about terribly. Right? In sort of 15 years of doing this, I've seen very few cases where a job offer has turned on references, right? Why? Because they're all pretty good. I mean, sometimes they're amazingly good, but you know, in 90% of the cases, they're really good. Spend that time worrying about references, thinking about your article, and practicing your job talk, right? If you're even thinking about this, it means you probably loved law school, and you're going to have a couple of professors who can vouch for you. Just a thought.
I would associate myself with those remarks and also add, you know, some faculty actually reject references because they feel like they are so good and they're only your cheerleaders, that we need to judge you on what we observed and you know, our sense of it. So the references for some committees are like a check the box, so you should be able to accomplish it, but they're not going to make their decision based on it, as was pointed out. So I think those are good points.
Thank you. And for the last question, as a current 1L, what are ways I can place myself on some stepping stones toward a law professor career in the next couple of years during my time in school?
I think one well, as a 1L, I forgot, they're not like a 2L or 3L. So as a 1L, it's really to just kind of focus on your studies the first year and do your absolute best your first year. And then later in your career in law school, think about law review and having your first publication as a law student. That's just one thing.
Yeah, I'll second that. The best thing you can do as a law student is to try to start writing, right? Write a paper of publishable quality sometime during your first, second, or third year. For better or worse, the thing that we care about the most is going to be those publications. It's not the only thing that we care about, but it's the thing that gets your foot in the door, at least originally. So if you just get in the habit as a 1L of thinking about interesting problems and ways that you want to approach them, that's by far the best thing that you can do. And again, try to come out of law school with at least one paper that you think that you can submit for publication. You'll be ahead of the game.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Dean Hill, Dean Lawson, Professor Zilberman, Professor Clowney, Professor Ben-Dan, Professor Feibleman, and Professor Atkins, and Professor Michaels. This has been wonderful and hopefully helpful for all of our listeners. Thank you and take care.